So welcome everybody to the Byte-Size Talk series. It's my pleasure today to introduce Alex Peltzer, a former colleague of mine at Cubic Tübingen and currently clinical bioinformatician lead at Boehringer Ingelheim Pharma. And he will talk today about how to do a first pipeline release of an NF core pipeline. So stage is yours, Alex. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Gisela, for doing the kind introduction. So as Gisela already mentioned, we're going to talk a bit about the pipeline first release. So if people are building a pipeline with NF core and the NF core tools, how they can actually do such a pipeline first release when they finished polishing their work in a pipeline. So just to give you a very brief overview, since this is a bite-sized talk, this is only going to be about 10 to 15 minutes max. I'm going to briefly talk about the steps required to release the pipeline on NF core. So what do you have to do to actually prepare the pipeline a bit? And then we're going to have a look at how to make such a first release of the pipeline, because making a very first release of the pipeline on NF core is a bit different of making continuous releases. So for example, if you're collaborating with others already on an existing pipeline on NF core, this is handled a bit differently than what you're doing if you really have to release a pipeline for the very first time on NF core, because that actually makes it a bit more complicated. To just jump in, since this is a bite-sized talk, we are not going to talk about all of the steps. So certain prerequisites are already covered, so should already have been done by you. So for example, you should have joined the community. If you don't know how to do that, there is always, so the slides will be shared as well and linked on the recording of this talk. So you can actually click on the links if you're keen and have to do certain steps before actually working on making your first pipeline release on NF core. So you should have joined the community. You should have created a pipeline from the NF core tools template. There's also how to link here, how to do that. You hopefully also added some testing data to our test data repository that we have, or to the module repository where we also have some test data now for the DSL version 2 pipelines. And you also added the pipeline to the NF core organization. And how do you do that? How you do that is actually also briefly outlined here in a small how-to guide on the NF core website that you can check if you want to do that. So I'm just going to assume briefly that these prerequisites are actually already taken in, already done by you, and you're already kind of done with all of these steps and now are ready to actually get that pipeline to NF core with a proper release. So the very first steps is includes actually checking that your pipeline is actually following NF core guidelines. So for example, you should check that all the continuous integration CI tests on the dev branch should all be passing. So that would be something where you actually have to go on your pipeline page. You have to check the GitHub actions there and see whether all of the tests are passing. If this is the case, then you can check that off your list and just check again whether the NF core linting, for example, spits out some warnings, because if there are errors, this CI tests will not pass. But if there are warnings, they will pass because they're just listed as warnings. So that would be, for example, if you have outdated software requirements for your pipeline, you could, for example, think about actually updating to the very latest versions on Conda or BioConda and get these warnings to go away that way. You also have to make sure that you make your master or main branch the default branch again, and how you can actually do that is here. There is a linked how-to on GitHub itself that explains that in all details. So I'm not going to cover that here in the talk. And then after that, you can actually proceed using the tools. So we have this nice little tools, NF core tools, that can help you actually preparing your pipeline for a very first release and also for subsequent releases. So this is not very different from what you do if you already have released your pipeline at some point. So one thing that you should do then is you have to bump the version numbers on your dev branch. So for example, you can run NF core bump versions to 1.0.0, which would be your very, very first release then. And the NF core tools will take care of bumping all the required steps in your pipeline code automatically then. If you're keen on learning how to do that, there's also a nice tutorial website on our website, actually, that explains a bit more on how NF Core bump versions works like. The same applies to the changelog. So ideally, the changelog has to list what you've been doing on your pipeline. So for example, if it's the very first initial release, people tend to explain in detail what the pipeline is actually capable of, which features are already present in version 1.0.0 for the very first release. And you could actually add that all to the changelog. And then after doing all, these two steps, you could simply open the first pull request. There's also a small little how-to link here from your dev branch to the master or main branch, and hope that all your tests are still passing, that all the CI tests are running properly through, and testing your pipeline that it obeys all of the template requirements that we have in NF Core. Some extra information on the topic itself. So most pipelines in NF Core actually use a so-called semantic versioning. So in order to find out what that actually means, there's an extra link here on the bottom. And also a lot of the pipelines actually use code names for the pipeline releases. So if you have a pipeline release version 1.0.0, most people also use an additional code name for that pipeline. So for example, Eager pipeline, for example, uses Swabian city names, which are not generated by this, but there are also other possibilities like generating something with animals or colors or metals. And it's actually up to you if you want to add such a code name for your pipeline. But I just wanted to mention it here. So after that, you can actually start with the review phase. So the so-called fake pull request, which is a thorough core pipeline review by the NF Core team, or some more experienced pipeline developers who are then going through your entire pipeline code to check that it all is within the guidelines that we have set up for the community, that are set up by the community as well. So what we're going to do there is we're going to open a so-called fake pull request and then do a review against the very first commit in your pipeline code. This makes sure that we can actually check what you changed, what you modified in the entire pipeline structure, what you modified in the entire pipeline code that you wrote, in the documentation, and all those aspects of your pipeline. And that will then make it a bit more thorough than just a simple pull request when later, for example, updating the pipeline from version 1.0 to 1.1 or something like that. It's a good idea to ask for help here, because this is rather a complicated step. It's a one-time step in the most cases, because people are, after the very first release, we're not going to do these fake pull requests anymore. We're just doing regular pull request reviews for your pipeline. So it's a good idea to actually ping the core team, or simply write a small message in the request review or new pipelines channels on Slack to get some people to have a look at your code. And that actually involves everyone in the community. So everyone in the community can have a look, can actually write down some ideas if there's something that they spot, even if it's just a couple of simple typos. That's usually very helpful in that stage to actually get that fixed before actually making a really first release. And then it's up to you to fix all of the bugs in your pipeline. And once the core review team is happy with your changes and considers the pipeline to be within the scope of the NF Core guidelines, we will close that fake pull request. So you don't have to merge it. Actually, it's just a fake one. We don't really do anything with it, except for making that thorough initial core pipeline review. After that, we'll close it for you, so you don't really have to do anything with it. After that, you're actually really ready to do a proper release pull request. So once you got two proper reviews for your development to master or main branch pull request, you can actually merge that to the master release, and after that to the master branch. And after that, it's really up to you to create a new release. How you can actually do that, there's also a really nice guideline on how to on GitHub itself. So you can click that link on the published slides afterwards and go through the individual steps that are required to make a release on GitHub. It's a requirement that you use the same version as in the NF Core bump version. So if you bumped all the code versions to 1.0.0, you should really use 1.0.0 and not prefix anything like a V or uppercase V as a prefix for the versions. Don't do that. Just use the very same, because otherwise it's getting conflicting issues with Docker images and Conda environments and your actual pipeline code, and you don't really want to do that. It's also a good idea to now have a code name in that release description. So that would also be something that you can just copy from your changelog if you want to, if you already added a code name on your changelog, and to keep things in sync. Yeah, and that's it pretty much. And after that, you actually have your very first release of your pipeline. And now there is some extra optional steps. So for example, you could ask someone from the core team to get you a document object identifier DOI that allows you to cite the versions of your pipeline. This is something that a lot of the pipelines currently have. For example, I added here the one from AttackSeek, NF-Core AttackSeek, that has this nice little DOI button badge in the README on GitHub. And there is always a to-do in the main README of your pipeline, and that can be replaced with such a DOI badge. This is something that we have to set up for NF-Core in general. So you will have to ask someone from the core team who has access to Zenodo, which generates these nice little DOIs for your pipeline. And then they will actually come back to you and send you over the markdown and the badge code that you can then just simply add to your README and commit that, and please only this, not something else, to the master branch directly, or ask someone to do it for you. Yeah, this is optional. You don't really have to do it. We didn't make that an absolute requirement, but it's considered best practice. So, and it doesn't cost you anything. After your release, there is also one step required to make future development possible. So it's a good idea after you made your release on the master branch to do a bump version on your dev branch, again, to, for example, 1.0.1 dev. So you always have to keep have that suffix dev for development. You also can add an update to the changelog, add a new section for 1.0.1 dev. And if you're working on your code in your own fork of the main repository in NF-Core, you actually have to open a pull request to dev in NF-Core your pipeline from your fork with the above changes. I mean, because yeah, otherwise you can actually do that on the dev branch directly if you want to. Yeah, and there's a couple of extras that you can actually have follow up on. So if you want to do subsequent releases afterwards, which is always a good idea, there's never a pipeline that is entirely bug-free. There's maybe there are some edge cases that you did not follow, that you didn't know about in the beginning when you did your very first release. It's kind of common practice that people are doing frequent releases. So there's an extra tips and tricks section on the NF-Core website on how to do subsequent releases of your pipeline. There's also an extra how-to guide on adding features to existing pipelines. So these are probably the most interesting bits of reading that you can do after making your very first release, or even before, to inform yourself about on how to do this in the future. Yeah, and much of this is actually based on two how-to guidelines on the NF-Core homepage. So there's a making the first release how-to, and there's a release checklist, which is something that you can just simply print out basically and tick off what you've done already. So if you're keen on more details on the individual steps, this is a good way to check these first. And I think with that, I'm already done, and we can talk about questions that might have arisen.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex. I see so far no questions popping up in the chat, but I would actually have one. Do you have any tips for us on how to select code names for releases?
A good tip is, I think, to choose something that is easily memorizable. So some people have a pattern in mind. So for example, I know for the eager pipeline, for example, we had already a schema in the mind, because the initial eager version 1 pipeline, which was not NF-Core, had Swabian cities as code names already. So we kept that with the NF-Core release of the eager pipeline. I know that Zarek, for example, did something similar. They use, I think, mountains from a national park in northern Sweden. So that's one way to do it. But there are other pipelines, for example, I think AttackSeek and others, and also the tools release, they tend to use something with an animal name inside and some color code, I think. So as long as it's easily memorizable and it's relatively easy to generate multiple code names and then just choose one, I think that's, yeah, pretty much it. Easily memorizable, unlike a version number maybe. No.
Yeah, also like a bit of a space to be creative there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Are there any other questions from the audience? Please write them in the chat. You can read them out loud. Harshal has a question. I can also I can also make you co-host.
First Python release from the Crick hackathon. Ah, okay. That would be something interesting. Didn't know we had that.
We did a live pipeline release during the Crick hackathon. It's a nanosig pipeline.
Mm-hmm. So that is something we could probably also share if people are interested, or even I think that might be already, yeah, might be online somewhere already, so we can just link it to the slides. That would be a good idea. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Another resource to link it to. Okay.
Perfect, then. Thank you very much for the talk. And if there are any further questions, you can also join us on the NF Core Slack channel bytesize. We can continue the discussion there. And otherwise, see you next week for the next bytesize talk.
Thank you, everyone.